We all know that the Pacific Ocean lies west of the Atlantic Ocean. But how do you actually go from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean? You don't go west, in fact. You go east. The shortest crossing of the American continent takes you from Balboa Port on the Atlantic side, by the route I've marked down there, into the Pacific Ocean, to the west, but in fact to the east. There had been plans to build a direct route through Nicaragua. You can see roughly the sometimes discussed route up there, but the way we go is through the Panama Canal. It's not just that the route is oblique, the way it was discovered was oblique as well. Keats actually wrote about this when he wrote, "Stout quarters with eagle eyes, he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent on a peak in Darien." Keats' research was not very great. First of all, it wasn't Cortes, it was Balboa who discovered the Pacific. It's quite interesting to speculate what Balboa and his men would have thought they saw if they had seen the Pacific from somewhere on the route of the Panama Canal. But in any event, what they were looking for when they found the Pacific Ocean was not oceans. They were entirely uninterested in oceans. They'd seen a great deal of oceans. What they were looking for was gold, and they didn't find it. Obliquity is the idea that when we're pursuing complex objectives, we very often approach these objectives most effectively indirectly, obliquely. And that's an observation that applies not just to rather trivial observations like the route of a canal, but to a wide variety of other human activities. We don't become happy by pursuing happiness, despite what the American Constitution appears to say. It was translated 2 or 3 years ago into a film called The Pursuit of Happiness, spelt for some reason that remains obscure to me with a Y, which is a story loosely based on an autobiography by a guy called Chris Gardner, who describes his career, which begins on a fortunate day when in a hospital parking lot he sees a red Ferrari. And he decides from that day onwards that he wants a red Ferrari. He then rises through Bear Stearns, of happy memory, to be chief executive of a large securities firm, and to the great joy of every viewer of that film, finally acquires a red Ferrari. However, I think that story tells us more about a certain view of American life than it does about the pursuit of happiness. In fact, the man who probably wrote more about happiness than anyone else, although he didn't experience very much happiness in the course of his life, John Stuart Mill, wrote in his autobiography in the end, "I never wavered in the conviction that happiness is the test of all rules of conduct and the end of life. But I now thought that this end was only to be attained by not making it the direct end. Those only are happy who have their minds fixed on some object other than their own happiness. The happiness of others, the improvement of mankind, followed not as a means, but as itself an ideal end. Aiming thus at something else, they find happiness by the way." That's possibly the best exposition of the principle of obliquity, which I'm going to describe tonight, that I know. And that comes from the greatest of all utilitarians, John Stuart Mill. But it wasn't in thinking about either canals or happiness that I first came to think about the principle of obliquity. It's a strange and very sad coincidence that James Black, a British Nobel Prize-winning chemist, died on Monday of this week. It's an extraordinary, sad, and coincident fact, because the phrase, the principle of obliquity, I first encountered it in a conversation I had with Sir James Black more than 15 years ago. And that conversation, I was recounting some of the history of ICI. Now, some of you may be familiar with what Black did, many of you may not be. Black was a young chemist at the University of Glasgow who joined ICI in the years immediately after the First World War. He joined ICI because the company, which had begun its life principally in dyestuffs and explosives, had moved into petrochemicals and fertilizers. After the Second World War and the way in which antibiotics had been an important development in the Second World War, the senior management of that company believed that the application of chemistry in business in future lay not in these traditional businesses, but in pharmaceuticals. They were right, but it took a very long time for them to be proved right. And they started to be proved right in the 1960s, when Black and his team discovered beta blockers, which are the first drugs to be effective against hypertension, and one of the very first major blockbuster drugs. I was talking to Black about the question of why it was that he had left ICI in the course of soon after that and joined SmithKline. And that was a very important fact because at SmithKline he discovered another drug. He discovered anti-ulcerants, the drug which became for SmithKline Tagamet, and an imitation of that drug by Glaxo, which was called Zantac, actually became what was then the best-selling drug in the history of the pharmaceutical industry. In other words, Black was effectively responsible for events that transformed the function of three companies, and Black made more shareholder value, created more shareholder value than anyone else in the history of British business since the Second World War. The reason I was looking at the ICI story was I was looking at the change in the way ICI had described itself as the shareholder value movement gathered pace, and specifically as ICI had been subject to a takeover threat by Hansen and Hansen Trust in the early 1990s. In 1987, ICI said about itself, we aim to be the world's leading chemical company through the innovative and responsible application of chemistry and related science. Through achievement of our aim, we will enhance the wealth and well-being of our shareholders, our employees, our customers, and the communities which we serve and in which we operate. By the mid-90s, ICI had changed that statement. It became our objective is to maximize value for our shareholders by focusing on businesses where we have market leadership, a technological edge, and a world competitive cost base. I made that comparison in a talk I gave to the CBI conference at Harrogate in 1996, and that was when I had this conversation with Black. And I'm quite glad to go back to that particular comparison, because of course we all know what happened subsequently. The ICI share price reached its all-time high in the spring of 1997, and thereafter went through a relentless decline for 7 years. And at the end of that period in 2007, ICI, which for most of the 20th century had been Britain's leading industrial company, ceased to exist as an independent entity. That was what the people whose objective was to maximize value for our shareholders by focusing on businesses where we had market leadership did. What the people who, through the innovative and responsible application of chemistry and related science, with a subsidiary objective of, through that objective, enhancing the wealth and well-being of our shareholders, among others, that company created value steadily over the period. I was talking to Black about his experience of ICI, and he explained that he left ICI basically because the management of ICI wanted to focus his attentions on selling beta blockers rather than doing new research, which was what he wanted to do. And he went on to say, I used to tell my colleagues that if they wanted to make a lot of money, there were easier ways to make it than drug research. And he shook his head and said, how wrong could I have been? It is, he said, what I call the principle of obliquity, that very often you pursue major goals more effectively by not attacking them directly. And that phrase, the principle of obliquity, stuck in my mind and has been the basis of the book which I've written and talking about today. Actually, as far as the medicine, the pharmaceutical industry is concerned, the comparison was made rather more strikingly, perhaps, even before that conversation with Black. In the 1950s, two of America's leading companies, Merck and Pfizer, George Merck of Merck said, we never try to forget that medicine is for the people, it's not for the profits. The profits follow, and if we've remembered that, they have never failed to appear. In fact, the better we have remembered it, the larger they have been. And indeed, the larger they were and were and were and were. And that was compared with Pfizer, who said, so far as humanly possible, we aim to get profit out of everything we do. For a long period, Merck was actually markedly the most successful of the two. You may not be surprised to learn that that changed in the mid-90s as well. That Merck said, as a company, we are now totally focused on growth. And Merck, it turns out, not only did not succeed in growing, they did not succeed in sustaining their profitability, they did not succeed in sustaining their market leadership either. Once again, profits were best achieved when pursued obliquely. If profits are not achieved by the most profit-oriented companies, and the truth is the most profit-oriented companies in the history of the world were probably Enron, Bear Stearns, Lehman, companies that did make quite a lot of money for quite a lot of time, but in the end lost more money than they had ever made. And they lost it for reasons which are entirely predictable from that philosophy. They lost it because they had no protection against the greed of their own employees. If the most profitable companies are not the most profit-oriented, if the happiest people are not those who pursue happiness, it's also true that the wealthiest people are not the most materialistic. I've just put a variety of quotes from extremely rich men on this particular slides. And for me, the most extraordinary one is the one at the bottom from Donald Trump. I have to say I imported Donald Trump's autobiography from the United States, and I cannot honestly recommend anyone to read Donald Trump's autobiography, in the expectation that here I would find a description by someone whose activities were entirely focused on enhancing his own material wealth. I was startled to discover that the very first sentence of that autobiography is the one which I've put on the bottom. I don't do it for the money, he began. I've got enough money, much more money than I'll ever need. I do it to do it, he said. deals are my art form. Echoing perhaps John Stuart Mill, whom I suspect Donald Trump has not read very much of, he was focused on some object other than that of making a great deal of money. An art or pursuit followed not as a means, but as itself the ideal end. Achieving thus at something else, you find wealth along the way. Now, this isn't simply true. Obliquity isn't something that applies to the business world as well. In fact, we've a history of replacing the direct and the oblique in the course of the 20th century across a whole variety of areas of human activity. One rather striking example was architecture, where technology in the 20th century essentially released architects from the burden of a historic convention and tradition. You could build anything. In Le Corbusier's famous phrase, a house is a machine for living in, and could be designed in that kind of way. On the left, you see what he did design. This was the strategy that led to the creation of tower blocks, which in the end, not very many people did like living in. And what you see there is one of the tower blocks he built in Marseille, which were the very first examples of this kind of building to be constructed. What you see on the right is perhaps a rather more remarkable building than the Marseille tower blocks, which is Notre Dame, which was built over 2 centuries by a variety of architects, and no one had the faintest idea when they started building it what it was going to look like in the end. The era of modernism in architecture is over, and architects have understood that there's quite a lot to be learned implicitly from the classical tradition. This is a comparison which I've always enjoyed from Sir Ernest Gombrich's Story of Art, where he begins by contrasting how in the 16th century it became possible, both philosophically and technically, for painters to paint things realistically in a way they had never done so in the past. And he gives us example Dürer's painting of a hare, which is indeed a remarkably true-to-life representation of a hare, a representation of a kind which no one could have easily imagined before that. He contrasts that with what you see on the right, which is Picasso's representation of a cockerel. Now, a child might say that cockerel doesn't look very like a cockerel, but it actually captures the aggression and stupidity of a cockerel very much better than a photograph of a cockerel or an equivalent would actually do. We can assume that Picasso, as Gombrich points out, that Picasso could have drawn a realistic depiction of a cockerel if he wanted to. In fact, he drew that. He drew something a great deal better. And he said not just about that, but about his art most generally. Art is the lie that tells us the truth. And I think when we look at that kind of representation, we can see what it is that Picasso meant. I've given a whole variety of examples of what it is we mean by obliquity and how it is that obliquity applies across a whole range of phenomena. But if I'm to persuade you of the importance of this kind of way of thinking, I think I need to do something to say why. Why is it that we often pursue our objectives indirectly? Surely it must be the case that we're more successful at doing something if we plan to do it than if we don't. Well, one should be quite clear there are quite a lot of things which are best done by intending to do them. If you want to pass an examination, it's generally wise to go to courses that relate to that examination, to read the relevant textbooks, and to turn up on the day the exam is being held. And no one could dispute that that is an activity that is best achieved directly, And if you think you're going to pass the examination incidentally as an incidental to doing something else, you will be making the mistake that lots of students whom I taught at Oxford, not, I'm glad to say, Andrew, but students with whom Andrew is familiar today, go on making generation after generation. But the areas in which obliquity pays off are areas in which we have rather complex goals that have many components to them, that are often incompatible and incommensurable. Problems in which we find out more about the nature of our goals in the actual process of achieving them, as the builders of Notre Dame did. We that is not very fashionable. The current fashion is to say we need to define our goals more precisely. We need to have clear prioritization. I'll give you an example here, which is we've been talking already about human flourishing, and the United Nations measures a human development index, and they publish elaborate tabulations of that for all the major countries of the world every year. You'll be glad to see what the formula for human development is at the top. It's based on L minus 25 over 60, where L is life expectancy. It's based on 2/3 R over 99, R is literacy, plus 1/3 E, where E is the proportion of the relevant cohorts who are in primary or secondary education, plus 1/3 GDP per head. And these numbers are calculated to the third decimal place for every country in the world, with one or two exceptions like Afghanistan and Burma and North Korea, which are not very good at supplying the data, which is relevant for this particular calculation. Does that calculation, now, the intentions of this are entirely admirable, and I'm sure they're right to say that longevity, education, and material wealth are all components of human development. But does this actually say more, or does it say less than Aristotle said about the same thing, which is what is the highest good in all matters of action? As to the name, there is almost complete agreement for uneducated and educated alike. Call it flourishing. I'm not sure there is such agreement anymore, but that's the way he expressed it, and make flourishing identical with a good life and successful living. They disagree, however, about the meaning of flourishing. And I think that's true, and is why flourishing, the goal we have, both our individual lives and as a society, is something that is best pursued indirectly. The world, too, for many problems, is characterized by uncertainty. And by uncertainty, I don't just mean risk. I don't mean just that we don't know what is going to happen. I mean that we don't even know the kind of things that might happen. And one of the things which I hope we're starting to learn as a result of the last 2 or 3 years is that Donald Rumsfeld didn't say many things that were very sensible, but when he made a distinction between known unknowns, the things we know we don't know, and the unknown unknowns, the things we don't know, he was actually making a distinction which is very important, and a distinction which is very relevant to running both our political world and to running our business. Finally, we face a great many problems that have inherent complexity about them. And the way we deal with complexity, and the only way we can deal with complexity, is to build models and tell stories about them. But we have to realize that the models we build and the stories we tell have to be problem-specific, and it's difficult to tell which is the most important problem, the most appropriate model for a particular problem. I'm just giving an illustration here as a certain amount of fun of the paradoxes to do with obliquity and directness that when I used to live in Oxford, I remember some friends inviting me to a dinner party in Hyde Park Gardens. And I got the train to Paddington as one would, and I then got the Underground, which is what people who are unused to travelling in London typically do. And if you look at the Underground map and see how you go to Hyde Park Gardens, my friends had helpfully told me the nearest tube station was Lancaster Gate. And you can see what the tube map tells you. It's quite easy to go from Paddington to Lancaster Gate. You just go 2 stops to Notting Hill, change at Notting Hill, and then you go to Lancaster Gate. What that doesn't reveal, and the Underground map doesn't tell you, is that Lancaster Gate, is that Hyde Park Gardens is less than 500 yards walk from Paddington Station. Interestingly, it's even got better than this since I made that mistake. The Transport for London now has a website that will tell you the best way to use Transport for London services in order to get from any destination in London to any other. And the way it tells you to get from Paddington Station to Hyde Park Gardens is you take a bus which turns right up Eastbourne Terrace. You then get off the bus, walk back the way you came, and walk to Hyde Park Gardens. And there is, of course, a demented logic to this. If you are determined to use the services of London Transport in going from Paddington Station to Hyde Park Gardens, that is the least time-consuming way of doing it. But what it reveals for us, and this is important to understanding obliquity, what that reveals to us is you have to frame the question rather carefully in order to get the right answer through a mechanical process of arriving at it. And it also reveals the issue which the London Tube map reveals. One might say that my mistake was because the London Transport map isn't very good. But the London Transport map is rightly regarded as an inspired piece of graphic design. It has changed the way people think around the world about design problems, mapping and problems. It just happens not to be the appropriate tool for that kind of problem. And if you ask how you would know that it's not the appropriate tool for that kind of problem, the only way you know that it's not the appropriate tool for that kind of problem is through experience that gives you the wider knowledge of London, which I now have, and which would never lead me now to make the kind of error I made then. In other words, we need obliquity because we have multiple goals, because the systems we deal with are complex, and because the world is fundamentally uncertain. Even then, you must still have the idea that nagging in your minds that we must do better at achieving something if we're trying to do it than if we're not. But the truth is that we've learnt since Darwin, in effect, that that is not the case. Some of you may know the curious story of cleaner fish. What happens in tropical oceans is that large fish, like sharks, swim to what are called cleaning stations. And at cleaning stations, small fish swim into their mouths. These are the mouths of sharks. They eat the debris which is on the teeth of the sharks, and they swim out again, unharmed. It's an extraordinary process, and it's obviously a process that no one could have designed, and nobody did. Now, I've posed myself from time to time the question, what would a management consultant called in to advise on that kind of system do? Well, he would start probably by recommending that the sharks eat the cleaner fish. You're right, if he was a bit more sophisticated, he might develop a model of the ecosystem of this particular environment, in which he attached probabilities to the cleaner fish being eaten, the benefits that the sharks derived from the cleaner fish, and so on. I don't know what the answer would be to that, although I've enough experience of developing models for clients to know that if I were given that job, I could devise a model that would give any answer my client wanted to that particular question. But what we learn from that is the story that evolution has designed a system that is far more subtle, far more complex than anyone could have designed or did. This is, in a sense, the way in which Darwinism threw back the argument for design in the face of the people who were propagating it, by explaining how it could be that adaptation and evolution could arrive at structures that were more sophisticated and more complex than those anyone could have designed. And the mistake we've made is not fully realizing the extent to which that is just as true of human and social institutions as it is of natural and biological ones. So that the basic reason why evolution, why obliquity is ubiquitous in its application, is that evolution, or what I would prefer to call adaptation, because there are many kinds of evolution other than the one that Darwin described in natural selection, the process of adaptation is generally smarter than we are. And it's the process of adaptation that leads us to the best solutions in terms of building great businesses, in terms of becoming wealthy, and in terms of becoming happy. Now, everything I've been saying tonight is designed to move away from what publishers always ask you to do, especially if you're publishing books in the business world, which is to come up with a list of 10 things at the end that are takeaways from this particular talk and will change your life if you only start applying them tomorrow. But in the face of publishers' pressures, I'm going to suggest 2 or 3 takeaways of that kind that you can have to discuss over drinks this evening. The first is to say that we should approach the world as foxes rather than as hedgehogs. Some of you will know the distinction made by Tolstoy and popularized by Isaiah Berlin between the hedgehog who knows one big thing and the fox who knows many little things. One of the most intriguing studies I've read in recent years has been Philip Tetlock's study of political judgment, where he had made over a period of 20 years accumulated predictions made by experts in a variety of fields, and then evaluated the quality of these predictions. And the one strong correlation which he found as a good predictor of the quality of predictions was how famous the person making the prediction was. And the correlation was negative. That is, the better known the person who made the predictions, the worse it possibly, the better known the person who made the predictions, the worse the predictions were. And his explanation for that was in terms of that distinction between hedgehogs and foxes. Hedgehogs who know one big thing and have one simple answer to give to questions are more likely to appear on the Today program than the foxes who say, well, the world is actually mostly rather complicated. But unfortunately, the world mostly is rather complicated, and that's why we need oblique approaches to it. Good decision makers are typically hedgehogs, not foxes. The second thing we should take away is how much of our time nowadays is spent on exercises which I call bogus rationality. I would guess that everyone in this room has spent some of their lives filling in forms which are, they may be investment appraisals, they may be staff appraisal forms, they may be risk assessments, all these kind of exercises. almost every one of them is something we fill in after the event, not before. We don't actually use these to make our decisions as to who we should promote or who we should fire or what we should invest in. We use these exercises to justify these decisions which we've already made on rather different grounds. The world today is afflicted with this kind of spurious process rationality. And we would do much better to recognize that these are not, in fact, the ways in which we make decisions. I talk in the book about Franklin's rule and Franklin's gambit. Benjamin Franklin famously wrote down for Joseph Priestley what he described as the right way of making decisions, which was you make a list of pros and a list of cons, and you look at the length of the list, and you attach weights to each of these, and you get a score for the two. And he said, I found great advantage in this kind of moral algebra. I suspect Franklin, who was an extremely clever man, had his tongue firmly in his cheek when he wrote that. That's Franklin's rule, because he also defined what I call Franklin's gambit, when he said how good it is to be a reasonable person, because it enables one to find reasons for anything one has a mind to do. And that is typically how we really approach these kind of processes. Third thing I want to say is we should recognize the limitations of our knowledge. It's a constant refrain when you look at the works of people who have proved brilliant decision makers. I've looked at the work of the great successful investors, because they're people who are single-mindedly making decisions in an environment in which they compete with other people. People like Buffett and Soros. And one of the things you realize if you read what they say about what they do, is how ready they are to acknowledge the uncertainty and the limitations of their knowledge of the world. Most people, particularly in the financial world, do not acknowledge that kind of uncertainty and are reluctant to admit their mistakes. Buffett and Soros, even though they don't make very many, are very ready to acknowledge the mistakes they do make. We've learned, if we didn't know it before, in the last couple of years, that people in the financial world are singularly reluctant to admit that they made mistakes in the past. Good decision-making involves recognizing the inevitable limitations of our model in coping in that kind of environment. And finally, good decision-making involves being unapologetic about making judgments. One of the things I worry about in giving a talk like this is that people will go away regarding it as a story in favor of something called intuition. And the trouble is, what we mean by intuition is frequently a great deal of nonsense. I would prefer to talk about judgment and expertise than I would about intuition. I've enjoyed this particular slide here. This appeared first in the Daily Mail under the headline, Beckham, a physics genius. And it came from an article in a journal called Sports Engineering that described how Beckham scored a goal which won a match for England against Greece in a famous encounter 7 or 8 years ago. We know that the shot left his foot at 80 miles an hour from 27 meters out, moved laterally over 2 meters during its flight, suddenly slowed to 42 miles an hour, dipping into the top corner of the goal. The deceleration happens at the moment when the airflow pattern around the ball changes from turbulent to laminar mode, increasing drag by more than 100%. Beckham was instinctively applying some very sophisticated physics calculations in scoring that great goal. Well, I'm not quite sure what this last statement means. I don't quite know how you would solve complex differential equations instinctively, and I'm extremely certain that that was not what Beckham was in fact doing. But Beckham had genuine expertise in scoring that goal. There is no doubt that whatever the origins of Beckham's skills are, they are real. those of you who read Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink, will know the example he takes of the Getty Kouros, the Greek statue, which had been attested as authentic by careful scientific research. But a fair proportion of art experts immediately identified as a fake. Gladwell talks mainly about the fact that they were able to identify it as a fake quickly. What I think is much more important is that art experts were able to identify it as a fake. That is, they were experts and they had genuine expertise. If you and I identified the Kouros as a fake, no one would care very much. The point about these judgments is they're made by people who have genuine demonstrated expertise. And the fact that we find it difficult to articulate, either in Beckham's case or the art expert's case, exactly what the basis for that judgment is, doesn't get us away from the empirical demonstration that this judgment is proven to be effective by past performance. The difficulty we have in articulating the basis of the decision certainly doesn't mean that they were bad decisions. The two worst groups of decisions in public decision-making in the last decade were probably made in the public sphere in the events that surrounded the invasion of Iraq, and in the private sphere by the events that led up to the credit crunch. It seems to me both of these are usefully explained in terms of the analysis which I've been describing this evening. In the case of the credit crunch, the people who ran these large banks believed they had far more control over their organizations and far more knowledge of the world than they in fact did have or could have had. More than that, in terms of the way they managed their risk control processes, they believed that what had typically been made historically by the judgment of experienced bankers could be replaced by new and far more sophisticated quantitative risk models. And they were wrong in all of these things. In the case of Iraq, I asked myself, and I struggled before the invasion of Iraq, to know what I thought about it. Today I'm rather clear what I should have thought about it. And what I should have thought about it was not to engage in a complicated analysis of the consequences and effects of these actions, which are so complicated as to be quite impossible to analyze fully. I should have asked myself the question, if you are creating an extremely complex and unpredictable set of events, are the people in the White House, Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld and the like, are these the kind of people you would trust to deal with that kind of situation? I should have made a judgment about their judgment. And if I'd approached the issue that way, I think I would have been led to the right conclusions and for the right reasons. And I think that's the way we should all start to think and be unapologetic in thinking about the ways in which we make decisions in the public sphere, in the private sphere, and in our personal lives.
John, thank you very much. These ideas, perhaps in an oblique way, seem simultaneously simple and also rather teasing. You talk a lot about institutions, companies, governments, families, individuals. And you make the point that to achieve the objectives that ex post people want to have achieved, they need to tackle them obliquely. How persuaded are you that it's the obliquity as opposed to the complexity? Well, let me put it this way. It seems to me that a lot of your argument is that the objectives that people really want to achieve are very complicated. So to run a good business isn't a straightforward thing. To be happy is not a straightforward thing. And that the error we've made is to pretend that a simple model tells us the answer. So it's not that we're failing to achieve the objective we want, it's that we set ourselves stupidly a simple objective that isn't really the objective we have, but we've conned ourselves into thinking that we can reduce the complexity into something simple.
I think several of the things you describe are going on in some of the events and processes I've described. First of all, this is clearly true of happiness, for example. We don't quite know what it is, and we'll never be able to quite know what it is. We learn about what it is through the process of trying to achieve it, and that's inevitable. So in that case, it's clearly very much the complexity of the objectives. And that's true, it seems to me, of most political decisions, as well. One of the natures about things about democratic government is one of the jobs we want that democratic government to do is to find out what it is we really want. And that's part of the task of government. So it's sometimes the complexity of the objectives. It's sometimes the complexity of the structure with which we're dealing with. So our simple models, as you've described them, are so completely inadequate to describe the complex system we're handling, that decisions based on these simple models, are actually worse than the incremental adaptive decision making which I'm describing. And I think the examples I gave at the end, Iraq and the credit crunch, illustrate, all of these phenomena. You don't quite know what it is you want, and you model these processes in simple ways that are actually so unrealistic they prove to be misleading.
And let me attempt a defense of some of what might be thought of as the kind of absurdity of the engineers and Beckham. I don't think that you said what I'm going to accuse you of saying. In fact, I'm sure you didn't. But one might look at the work of many scientists and social scientists who do extremely complicated things, the sorts of things that Mr. Kay and I used to do in the early 1980s at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And I can remember a particular piece of work on which you and I collaborated, which was about assessing the impact of the tax and social security system on people's incomes when they were in and out of work. And that was at a time when the tax and social security system were at least as complicated as they are today. And the point was frequently made by people when we presented this work that this was ludicrous in much the same way as the Beckham quote was ludicrous, because no unemployed or potentially unemployed person could possibly work out what the consequence of being either employed or unemployed would be on their income, and so it couldn't affect their behavior. The response that I'm pretty sure you gave then, and I've given on many occasions since, was that we don't have to believe that that's how people are behaving, but the complicated measurements that we can undertake will tell us what the consequences for individuals will be. They will experience those consequences, and then they will be copied by other individuals. So you're not arguing for a running away from all complicated science and social science, just that we should be a bit more modest about it?
Yeah, I think that's right. And the Carey sports engineering and Beckham example is a good illustration of that. Because I think what Carey is doing is quite useful. And he is indeed explaining how it is that goal worked in the way it did. What he is clearly not doing, and what he appears to be doing, particularly in the way his work was headlined, is describing how Beckham actually did it. And there is another question of how Beckham did it, to which Beckham does not know the answer, certainly, and only with difficulty can rather more thoughtful, intelligent people than Beckham arrive at the answer. And the truth is, it must be so, because if one could write a set of differential equations that would enable one to score goals like Beckham, then Beckham would cease to be an outstanding footballer. It's, as it were, in the nature of expertise that it can't be fully articulated, and not everyone has it or can have it. And that's why we need to respect such expertise a lot more than in this kind of structure we appear to be doing.
There's one last set of questions or points I want to put to you before we throw it open to the audience, and that is that I feel as though we've seen some of the problems you identified broadly first in economics, that in economics we very early on saw what I think we would both agree was a kind of bastardization of economics asserted to be true, which was that everybody should at all times and in all places be seeking simply their own financial self-interest. It seems to me that one of the things you're arguing for is a recognition that that kind of bastardization of a view of all human activity has spread and has become more and more pervasive, that we are less and less comfortable with assertions of goals which are softer and grander. Why?
Yeah. I think it's because it has a kind of pseudoscientific structure, which can be applied generally. One of the things I knew I needed to devote a chapter of the book to, but which is a chapter principally aimed at economists, which is to say that economists have defined rationality as consistency. And consistency isn't, in fact, what people ordinarily mean by rationality. If I commune every night with the fairies at the bottom of the garden, that's consistent. But it's not in any ordinary sense of the term, a rational thing to do. But this is what we mean by, as economists mean by consistency. And that's the basis of the rational choice modeling of behavior, which has taken over a wide range of social sciences, because it appears to be the most scientific way of approaching these kind of problems. It also leads to the idea that if people are behaving consistently, they must be maximizing something. And that's terribly influential amongst economists. And it's something that troubled me for a long time. I used to teach the standard models, as you know, in which people maximized utility and firms maximized profits and so on. And I think we always knew that people didn't maximize utility in any obvious sense. When I learnt more about firms and concluded that they didn't really maximize profits either, I started to worry if they didn't maximize profits, what did they maximize? And there was a day when the scales fell from my eyes and I realized, well, perhaps they don't maximize anything. Firms are actually complex political institutions in which people have different goals that they bargain with each other about. And that's the nature of organizations, of all organizations, including business organizations. And if you approach it in that more eclectic way, in that more fox-like way, I think you get far more insight into what it is that business really does.